Um, all right, so tonight we're going to look at Shabbat, and I'll send out these documents, but but right now I'm just going to call them up. So tonight what we're going to do, we're going to do 3 weeks on Shabbat, and tonight what we're going to do is just look at some texts on Shabbat because here I'll bring it up here. Let's see, is this it? All right, yes. Shabbat in the Torah, or actually, there's some passages in other books in the Bible, but like mountains held by a hair, that's the phrase that the rabbis use to refer to the laws about Shabbat. Because there is very little information about how to observe Shabbat in the Torah, and yet there are reams and reams of rules and discussions of the Shabbat observance in the rabbinic period. So that's what the image there is. It's a mountain, all this mountainous material held by a very thin hair, which is what the information in the Torah. So I wanted to look at this, but first I wanted to just make a comment about the uniqueness of Shabbat in Judaism, and why it's so important to Jewish life. First of all, that Shabbat is unique because it's the only holiday we have that is not tied to nature. That is Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Hashanah, first day of a month. So it's the new moon. Pesach and Sukkot fall on the full moon. And these holidays are annual, so they're connected in some way to the solar calendar. Also, well, the day, the daytime, the clocking, the service times, the worship times, various other things to the daytime hours, nighttime hours, again connected to nature. Even Pesach, our calendar, while it is a lunar calendar for the most part, that is that each month depends on the new moon appearance. Passover has to be in the spring. So that's why we have this. So it's a solar calendar too, because you have to account for the seasons. That's the difference between, if you ever pay attention to when Ramadan is, sometimes it's in the summer, sometimes it's in the winter, and that's because they have a truly lunar calendar. But ours is adjusted for by the seasons because Pesach has to be in the spring. So every couple of years, every 2 to 3 years in a 19-year cycle, we add a month to our calendar. So all the holidays are connected in some way to nature, except for Shabbat, and Shabbat's the most important holiday. There's nothing in nature that is a 7-day cycle. My understanding is there are some other cultures that do recognize the seventh day. So I'm sure that we weren't the only ones. Maybe we even borrowed it from some other culture. But what is unique about Judaism, we're the only ones who celebrate that seventh day as the essential holiday. And it is the most important holiday. I mean, you could maybe argue Yom Kippur is significant in other ways, but Shabbat is the most important holiday. And again, the rules about Shabbat, the seriousness with which tradition takes Shabbat. I mean, if you're breaking the rules on Shabbat, then we'll talk about that next week a little bit. But and we'll get to look briefly at one of the passages in the Torah. But the death penalty is if you were to, well, we followed the Torah and we followed rabbinic law at its most extreme. If you transgress Shabbat rules, you do something you're not supposed to do, then it would be a death penalty. So it's a very serious, legally, there's serious ramifications. So it's unique. Shabbat is very, very unique for us, that this seventh day, which has nothing to do with nature, it is completely imposed. in terms of the whether God imposed or culturally imposed on the Jewish people. So let's go through some of the past. We're not going to look at all these sources from the Torah because I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I want to look at some other material too about the meaning of Shabbat. But here's obviously the very beginning of the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God finished the work that God had been doing, and God ceased on the seventh day from all the work that God had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all the work of creation that God had done. So a couple of things here that are very interesting. So first of all, we see the seventh day. God, and the question that's always asked, on the seventh day God finished the work, and he ceased on the seventh day. So wait a minute. If he finished the work, or what did he create? I mean, if this is still, it sounds like the seventh day God was taking a break. So here it says, so what did God put? So the question, the Rashi, the great commentator, asked, well, what did God create on the seventh day? And the answer is rest. So up until that point, there was just constant movement, creation, construction, building, growing out in the world. Had God not given us the seventh day, there would have been just constant development, building, until there would have been no space for anything. There would have been just continuous motion. So God had to create a cessation of motion. And that's one of the things we see here. God ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. What was the work he was doing on the seventh day? Well, it was rest. The other thing that's interesting here is this is the only thing in the creation story that's called holy. There's none of the, even human beings, the earth, nothing is called holy. Only the seventh day is referred to as holy. Or it's the first thing, we should say, that's called holy. And the only thing in the creation process. So I think that's very significant. Now, that doesn't mean that already people are observing the Sabbath. But what's interesting here is I wanted to just show you in chapter 16 of Exodus. This is before the 10 Commandments. This is the people they've left Egypt. They're on the way to Sinai. They haven't got there yet. And they're starving. Of course, they don't have any food. And they complain. And God says, okay, well, I'm going to send you manna, your special food. And on the sixth, every day the food is coming down. You pick the manna up every day and you eat it. But on the sixth day, Friday, there's going to be double amount of food. And then that happens, and the chieftains show up. This is I love this passage because it's so redolent of what we do in the world today when you send out emails every week and then people say, I didn't see anything about, are we having services this week? I was like, did you see the email? Oh yeah, I didn't pay attention to the email. So here, this is the biblical version. So God has told the people, told Moses, and Moses has told the people, 6th day, double amount, because it's the 7th day we don't pick. So the 7th day shows up, and the chieftains of the community come and they told Moses, they said, hey, we got double amount today. And he goes, yes, this is what God was telling you. Tomorrow is the Sabbath, or it's not the Shabbat day, it's a Friday. Friday they get double. And tomorrow is the day of rest, a holy Sabbath of the Lord. Now remember, this is pre-10 Commandments. So it's very interesting because something is going, so already there is this tradition, at least, again, taking the Torah at face value, there is this tradition, or there's an assumption in the work that already there is a tradition of something unique on the Sabbath. And that's so he's letting them know tomorrow's a day of rest. It's a holy Sabbath to the Lord. And then you do whatever you want with the food, but then and it won't go bad on Shabbat. like it does if you don't pick it in the morning on any other day of the week. 6 days you shall gather it, and on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will be none. So make sure you get food for enough food on Friday for the Sabbath. So that's just very interesting that already there's this notion, or at least the Torah wants us to understand, there is this consciousness of the specialness of the seventh day. Now, here's the Ten Commandments. This is where, of course, we get the rule about observing the Sabbath. And we're going to look at the difference between the Ten Commandments here in Exodus, that is the Ten Commandments at Sinai, the revelation, and then the Ten Commandments that Moses repeats to the people in the book of Deuteronomy. Pretty much the same, but there are some significant differences. So at Sinai, they hear, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them. God rested on the seventh day, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So this is connecting us back to the creation story. Very significant here. It's not just that you're not supposed to do any work. You rest too, just like God. We're emulating, right? This is imitatio Dei. This is imitation of God. We don't work because God didn't. God ceased from labor, so we cease from labor. It's not just us, though. It's not just the family, the slaves too. Now that has to be because, it's always a very uncomfortable question. Jews going through slavery and they were liberated, and there's all these rules about having slaves, both Jewish indentured slaves and foreign slaves, in the Torah, which is a little embarrassing. From our moral code, it's a little embarrassing. But here it makes it very clear that they did learn something from that experience, or at least God wants them to learn something from that experience. Everybody gets a day off. Even your slaves, they don't work on Shabbos. Even the cattle, even the stranger, right? These are obviously, we're talking about here. Now the term here is ger, so some people say ger is now the modern term for a convert, but clearly here it's somebody who's not Jewish, who's living within the Jewish settlements, and they're also supposed to follow this rule, probably because if they're not following it, then it encourages other people not to follow it. But the point is that everybody gets a day off. And the reason why, the motivation, because imitatio Dei. That's what God did at the creation story. And we work 6 days, but we get a seventh day off. We cease from labor, just like God. Now, and here it's remember, Zachor at Yom HaShabbat. Now we get down here to the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. And here notice it's a little bit different. It begins, observe the Sabbath day. The word in Hebrew is shamor, which is the modern term for people who are Shabbat observers. The term is shomer Shabbat. Are you a shomer Shabbat? Are you a person who does not do work on Sabbath? So here it's shomer. So observe, so that's interesting. What's the difference between remember and observe the Sabbath day? We'll give a suggestion. Otherwise, it's pretty close. Observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle. It's a little expanded here, not just the cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. And now here is a different motivation. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So here, this one is a little bit different, obviously. Now, also, the community that is hearing this is different. Remember, in Deuteronomy, this is 40 years after the liberation. Everybody who was an adult at the time of the Exodus is dead. This is the end of Moses' life, his final orations. After the people refused to go into Israel to follow directly into Israel because of the spies incident, and the spies who say too dangerous to go in, we're not going, it's a bad place, they're punished with wandering in the desert until all of the adults of that generation die off. So there could have been some kids, some young people who were there at Sinai, but many of the people who are now listening to Moses' final sermons are have not were born in the desert, and so it's almost like he has to remind the people now, none of you were slaves. You were born free people, but you got to remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that therefore God saved you, and therefore everybody, in fact, it even emphasizes everybody rests on Shabbat, because nobody should have to be constantly should be like an automaton who's just forced to work constantly. Everybody gets a day off, and so that your male and female slaves rest just as you do. So it's a kind of like a reminder. It's what we do today at the Pesach table, right? Thank God most of us Jews who are celebrating Pesach have no clue whatsoever what it means to live in, unspeakable poverty, oppression, enslavement. But we tell ourselves that because so that we should know. Don't take it for granted what you've got today, and that's what this seems to be. So it's very interesting. First one is about creation, nature. That is why we observe this seventh day, because of God's work in creating the world. And this one is more of a social political explanation. You guys were once slaves. You know how horrible it is. Everybody has to rest. Nobody should be forced to work 7 days a week. Just one other comment here, because this is a passage that we recite on the Sabbath. We should mention that we recite both the creation story on Friday night. We recite these verses in the worship service on Friday night. We recite the Ten Commandment passage. Wait a minute. We recite the Ten Commandment passage. Well, we do it at lunch on Shabbat. But wait, why am I forgetting? Vaychulu is Friday night. Zachor. No, Zachor is at lunch. Is at lunch right before Kiddush at lunch on Saturday afternoon, Saturday at lunch. And the last thing that we recite this during worship services. Well, we recited Friday night service, but we also recited it in the Amidah on Shabbat morning, which is part of this passage, the concluding part here. And I just want to point this out because it puts in another emphasis about the meaning of Shabbat in the Torah that is picked up in later writings. So it says, speak to the Israelite people and say, nevertheless, you must keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout the ages, that you may know that I, the Lord, have consecrated you. So the Sabbath now becomes, according to this passage, a bridge, a connecting device between us and God. So it's not out of gratitude. It's not just about gratitude for the creation of the world, or to remind us of that experience. It's not about reminding us of the Exodus experience. It's that the Sabbath is a sign of our special relationship with God. When we keep the Sabbath, you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. Here's the line about death. The Hebrew profanes it shall be put to death. Now, the rabbis made it a little hard to put people to death for breaking Shabbos, but nevertheless, it's on the books there. That's the penalty if you got caught with all the that's what I'm looking for. If you could get caught, if you could get convicted of breaking the Sabbath, and there are a lot of obstacles, but if you got through all those obstacles, it's pretty serious penalty. Not that we have no proof that it was ever acted on, although in the medieval period, in some Jewish communities, there are some statements that people were surprised when they moved to certain communities. Wow, they put people to death here for not observing Shabbos. So it was a little bit, very rare, but there were some moments. Anyway, the 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath, okay, should we put that right? The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. This is Vishamru. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, lasot et ha-Shabbat l'dorotam. Brit olam. It's a covenant for all time. It's a brit. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai. For 6 days the Lord made et hashamayim v'et haaretz u'vayom hashvi'i, and on the seventh day God ceased from all the work. Vayi nafash, and literally took a breath. Nefesh is a breath, or was resouled, refreshed. Okay, so that's the the other significance just to this passage in Exodus, and because we're going to get to Heschel in a moment, it's very significant that these passages about the importance of Shabbat, which is reiterated here in Exodus 31, and in Exodus 34, also 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor. You shall cease from labor even at plowing time and harvest time. Both of these, that's the wrong passage. Here we go, 35:1. Moses convoked the whole community of Israel and said, on 6 days the work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest. And then there's this rule about no fire, you can't kindle a fire. Okay. But the point is that here in chapter 35, and here in 31 are both connected. They're, in this case, chapter 31 follows the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. And 35, it is at the commencement of the building of the tabernacle. So they get the instructions earlier in Exodus, and then just in terms of the narrative structure, they get the instructions for building the tabernacle. We get this passage about Shabbat. Then we have the whole section about the golden calf and the punishment for the golden calf and all that. And then we get back to Shabbat and the building of the tabernacle. So this close connection between building and a holy space and holy time being Shabbat is going to lead us right into our next piece here. Let me try to bring it up a little bigger so we can see. Okay. And this, wait, let me see. Can you see this page down that says the Sabbath is a day of redemption?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I never know if I have to start all over again. All right. This, and I really, really encourage you to acquire this book, The Sabbath by Heschel. It is just beautifully written, and it talks about the meaning of Shabbat in a very powerful way. I just took a passage of it here that we're going to look through. But the point that Heschel makes in this book, his famous point is that there is the world of space and the world of time. And holiness in time is more significant in Judaism than holiness in space. Even though there are things there are holy spaces, of course I guess we could argue they don't exist anymore because the temple doesn't stand. But that's the whole point, is that holiness in space is, even holiness in space is temporary. It can be destroyed, and maybe it can be rebuilt, but it's not forever, whereas holiness in time is always. And so here he is in this introduction to the Sabbath. He begins, what is so luminous about a day? What is so precious to captivate the hearts? It is because the seventh day is a mine where spirit's precious metal can be found with which to construct the palace in time. A dimension in which the human is at home with the divine, a dimension in which man aspires to approach the likeness of the divine. Now, I just have to say that in all the passages we're going to look through right now, I capitalized man in all of these works because these are written in the 50s and whatever 60s, and we're a little more sensitive about gender today. So here he means obviously man is mankind, right? I don't think Heschel even, I mean, when he wrote it, I don't think he was discriminating against women in any way. I just think he meant man as humankind. We would use the term humankind today. So here it is, this idea that man aspires, human beings aspire to approach the likeness of the divine. Just as we saw a moment ago, God created in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. God ceased from labor. That was part of the creative effort as well. And we do the same. We work hard on 6 days for 6 days, and then on the Sabbath, we take that break. From where shall likeness of God be found? There is no quality that space has in common with the essence of God. There is not enough freedom on the top of the mountain. There is not enough glory in the silence of the sea. Yet the likeness of God can be found in time, which is eternity in disguise. So if we want to strive to emulate God, how do you do it? The Torah tells us, we were created in the likeness of God, in the image of God. But and it's fascinating because there were definitely writers in the medieval period who said, yeah, well, there's something physical about God. Don't tell me, Maimonides, that there's no that God doesn't have any physicality. What are you talking about? But obviously, that's not how we usually think. We don't think that to be like God means what does it mean to look like God? But Heschel says it's not about space. It's about time. We can emulate God to some extent through time. For all the idealization, there is no danger of the idea of the Sabbath becoming a fairy tale. With all the romantic idealization, which Heschel does a great job of, the Sabbath remains a concrete fact, a legal institution, and a social order. There is no danger of becoming a disembodied spirit, for the spirit of the Sabbath must always be in accord with actual deeds, with definite actions and abstentions. The real and the spiritual are one, like body and soul in a living man. It is for the law to clear the path. It is for the soul to sense the spirit. And what he's leading us now to is the fact that, the Sabbath, to say we need to rest on the Sabbath is beautiful, but what does that mean? You have to actualize it in real deeds, in rules, regulations. You just need to, because otherwise, it can mean anything to anybody. And yet, if you want to create community in terms of worshiping the Sabbath, you need to have certain actions. He's also arguing that actually to appreciate the spirit of Shabbat, you do need some direction, some guidance as to what to do or what not to do. But as always, Heschel plays the balance. So here's one side of it. This is what the ancient rabbis felt. The Sabbath demands all of man's attention, the service and single-minded devotion of total love. The logic of such a conception compelled them to enlarge constantly the system of laws and rules of observance. They sought to ennoble human nature and make it worthy of being in the presence of the royal day. So to make Shabbat special, the rabbis, in their love of this day, of wanting to make it different from every other day, they answered questions. Well, what does it mean not to, and we'll talk about the meaning of melacha. I hate using the term work, that you're not supposed to work on Shabbat, because we have a certain conception of work. It's really melacha, which are certain types of creative activities. And we'll see in a moment for some people, some of the activities that we refrain from have nothing to do with work. Carrying a piece of paper outside your house, what does that have to do with work? Lighting a match, that's work. But their understanding of how to keep the Sabbath holy meant limiting these activities. And then questions come up. Well, can I do this? Can I do that? And that's where the rules got really complex and really weighted people down. So this is the one side. On the one side, it's because of their love and concern over this of making sure that Shabbat is special. That is what caused these laws to become so complex and rich. But as he says, here's the other side of it. Yet law and love, discipline and delight were not always fused. In their illustrious fear of desecrating the spirit of the day, the ancient rabbis established a level of observance which is within the reach of exalted souls, but not infrequently beyond the grasp of ordinary men. He realizes, writing this in the 50s, I believe, that the community that he's writing for, they don't have his background. Heschel came from a very traditional, we talked about this. It came from this very traditional background. So it was a community where everybody was involved with this with this commitment, this very extreme observance, and that was just what the community did. But the world he's now living in, 50s America, people don't understand that, and they're having a hard time. And if you present people, and it's true for today as well, if you present people and say this is the way you've got to observe Shabbos, most people are going to say no way, that's just impossible. So he recognizes that. But then he goes on to say, the glorification of the day, the insistence upon strict observance, did not, however, lead the rabbis to a deification of the law. The Sabbath is given unto you, not you unto the Sabbath. The ancient rabbis knew that excessive piety may endanger the fulfillment of the essence of the law. There is nothing more important, according to the Torah, than to preserve human life. Even when there is the slightest possibility that a life may be at stake, one may disregard every prohibition of the law. One must sacrifice mitzvot for the sake of man, rather than sacrifice man for the sake of mitzvot. The purpose of the Torah is to bring life to Israel in this world and the world to come. So he wants you to know that, okay, so even though the rabbis came up with more and more rules and these complexities, and you really have to study the laws of Shabbat if you want to try to observe it according to the way it's supposed to be observed on the books. He says, you know what? They still realize that human beings came first. That's most important. So they didn't lose it completely, lose their focus completely on what the point was. But they did make it hard. But he says here, there's a reason for it, making it, having these rules and having these regulations and telling people you can't do certain things because of this. Continuous austerity may severely dampen, yet levity would certainly obliterate the spirit of the day. One cannot modify a precious filigree with a spear or operate on a brain with a plowshare. It must always be remembered that the Sabbath is not an occasion for diversion or frivolity, not a day to shoot fireworks or to turn somersaults, but an opportunity to mend our tattered lives, to collect rather than to dissipate time. Labor without dignity is the cause of misery. Rest without spirit, the source of depravity. Indeed, the prohibitions have succeeded in preventing the vulgarization of the grandeur of the day. So what he's saying here at the end, and this is really the point that he wants to get across. So the other side is to say, and a lot of people do this, and I think it's, very positive, but yet what he wants to say is to go beyond this, which is also, so don't do the other side. Following all these rules can sometimes be oppressive. On the other hand, don't go the other side and say, hey, it's a day off. It's, it's my television day. It's just a fun day. He says, no, because ultimately the goal of the Sabbath is about mending our tattered lives. It's, he says, to collect rather than dissipate time. It's to find meaning in our existence. And so if it's just a fun day, you're not really going to get that. But you have to have some of this seriousness to the day, limiting ourselves in some way, disciplining ourselves. so that we can focus on the holiness of the day. On the other hand, he says, I recognize that, continuous austerity can just ruin the whole day. So that's Heschel on the Sabbath. That's one, and that's the book that I encourage you to read. But here's some other passages, different perspectives. This one is Norman Frimmer. He was an Orthodox rabbi. I believe his career was in Hillel work. He has a very different approach. He sees it, I think, in terms of that the importance of the Sabbath has to do with our ego. He says, beware, warned Moses millennia ago, lest when you have eaten and are satisfied, when you have built goodly houses, probably split level ones, when your herds and flocks have multiplied, when your industrial plants and commercial enterprises multiply, when your silver and your gold are increased, that your heart becomes high and mighty, and you forget the Lord your God, and say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have acquired for me this wealth. And to these spiritual afflictions, all men are singularly allergic. Judaism consequently felt very drastic measures were needed to provide a counteracting social and spiritual force. A radical and public demonstration was repetitively required, which should shake man out of his self-enslavement or self-deification. He must be motivated to stretch his spirit or shrink his ego, and then slowly to begin assuming his authentic stature as man. So I think Frimmer here is suggesting that one of the impacts of these limitations, these disciplines, we talked about this, but not so different from what I suggested with kashrut. It is to put a hold on our ego, a check on our ego, that we are not the end all and be all, that we do not, the sun doesn't rise and set on us, that there is something greater than us, God, or in the world around us, and that we're just a part of it. And so therefore, by limiting ourselves on the Sabbath, we remind ourselves that we're not everything. We shrink our ego, and we hopefully stretch our spirit to recognize our place in the world. So that's another passage about the meaning of the Sabbath. Now here's Gunther Plaut. Gunther Plaut's a very interesting guy. He's a very good scholar. He's no longer alive, but if you've ever been to a Reformed synagogue, most likely they have his commentary, or he was the editor of the commentary of the book that most or many Reformed congregations use for their Chumash. He's a great scholar, but a Reformed rabbi, and he writes here about the meaning of the Sabbath. This is already back, you can see 1970. Isaac Arama is a medieval scholar. He's actually in exile from Spain, lives in the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. And Arama differentiated between Sabbath rest and Sabbath sanctification. The opportunities of the Sabbath still lie in turning doing and not doing toward rest and sanctification. But we must understand these opportunities in the context of our time. We still need rest, but not primarily from work. Rather, we need rest from unrest. We do need sanctification in our lives, and particularly a sanctification of freedom, the cry for which is urgent in our time. I think what he means here, in this understanding of Shabbat, is that rest is one thing and sanctification is another. And that we have to recognize that on the Sabbath, we need to really focus on sanctifying, making Shabbat special. Now, here we go back to those two terms that I mentioned before in the two versions of the Shabbat of the Ten Commandments. You've got Zachoret Shabbat in Exodus and Shamoret Shabbat in Deuteronomy. And so one way of looking at that is Zachor, remember, are all the positive things, the things we should do to make Shabbat special. Having festive meals, being in community with fellow Jews, living, and celebrating and singing and having some in that special time and making Kiddush, which is, the blessing over wine, but it's a sanctification. We acknowledge the holiness of Shabbat. That's Zachor, and then Shamor would be observing Shabbat, which is don't do. Those are the negative things. Don't go to work, don't light a fire, don't all the other things that we're not supposed to do, for which are considered malacha. So he's focusing on the importance of sanctifying Shabbat. And he says, well, I think this is very interesting. We need rest, so it's not from work. He's saying, it's not like we need that. We got the weekend. This is America in 1970. I believe they had weekends in those days. What we need is from unrest. That is not doing significant things. Unrest would be, wasting time. Hobbies, less significant time off. Not that that's bad. It's not bad to have a hobby. It's not bad to go, play golf or tennis or do sports or go camping or anything. These are all great things, but that's not sanctifying time. So he's suggesting that we need something special. We got to make Shabbat special, in a positive way. Now, here's another passage. This is from the famous, the well-known psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, in his book, The Forgotten Language. And here he talks about he gives his definition for what does it mean to not work on Shabbat. To begin with the essential point, the concept of work, underlying the biblical and later the Talmudic concept, is not simply that of physical effort, but can be defined thus. Work is any interference by man, that human beings, be it constructive or destructive, with the physical world. Rest is a state of peace between man and nature. This is his understanding. And a lot of people talk about this. When we get to next week's reading, which is from the Sabbath by Dayan Isidore Grunfeld, who talks about, in greater detail of what is permitted and what's not permitted on the Sabbath, he understands it in a similar way, that work, malacha, is interfering in a constructive or destructive way with the physical world. So here's, Fromm goes on in greater detail. Man must leave nature untouched, not change it in any way, neither by building nor by destroying anything. Even the smallest change by man in the natural process is a violation of rest. The Sabbath is the day of peace between man and nature. Work is any kind of disturbance of the man-nature equilibrium. On the basis of this general definition, we can understand the Sabbath ritual. Indeed, any heavy work, like plowing or building, is work in this as well as in our modern sense. But lighting a match or pulling a grass blade, while not requiring effort, are symbols of human interference with the natural process. They are a breach of peace between man and nature. On the basis of this principle, we understand also the Talmudic prohibition of carrying something of even little weight on one's person. In fact, the carrying of something as such is not forbidden. I can carry a heavy load within my house or my estate without violating the Sabbath ritual. But I must not carry even a handkerchief from one domain to the other. For instance, from the private domain of the house to the public domain of the street. This law is an extension of the idea of peace from the natural to the social realm. Just as man must not interfere with or change the natural equilibrium, he must refrain from changing the social order. That means not to do business, but also the avoidance of that most primitive form of transference of property, namely its local transference from one domain to the other. I'm not sure he's right about that, but that is a great explanation for trying to understand why I can't, carry my whatever. There have been times I've forgotten my sermon at home and on Shabbat, and I'm just stuck because I can't carry it over to the synagogue. So I just, hopefully those weeks, remember something of what I wanted to say. So the idea is that even, so that you're not supposed to carry, which again, that's work, but no, but it is malacha. It's considered malacha. So here for Eric Fromm, it's about our relationship with the world. That Sabbath is about living within the world as part of that kind of state of nature. And we're not supposed to impose ourselves on it. One last thing, and then we'll, I think we'll finish up for tonight, and I'll send all this material to you. All right, this is from a modern Hasidic rabbi. I don't think he's alive anymore. The Slonim Rav, Rabbi Shalom Noach Berezovsky. And I wanted to bring him in here because he has a different approach to Shabbat, which is that we've seen so far. His is it's about redeeming the world. Every Shabbat has the power to bring redemption to the world. And this is why the commandment is written, keep the Shabbat and sanctify it. And you must remember because you were a slave in Egypt. This is the Deuteronomy version of the Ten Commandments. It is incumbent upon every Jew to remember and truly know the experience of the liberation from slavery, because it's on Shabbat that the possibility of Yitziat Mitzrayim, that's the Hebrew term for the exodus from Egypt, the liberation of those enslaved is renewed. And this is not exclusively for the sake of memory. Rather, it is for the sake of actually doing the work of Shabbat. A Jew must rise up from a place of degradation, a devastating situation, and find within himself ultimate freedom. What he's doing here is very much like what we do at the Pesach Seder. At the Pesach Seder, at the conclusion of right before the dinner, we say, in every generation, person has to see themselves as if they actually came out of Egypt. Because every generation, there's an Egypt. We're all in Egypt at some level. It might be psychological or emotional. In some cases, of course, in Jewish history, it was actual oppression and enslavement. But we're all in that place. And he's saying the same thing is about Shabbat, that in the world that we live in, we need liberation. And Shabbat is the time that we have that opportunity. So it's not just about memory, remembering, oh yes, our ancestors were slaves, and and they were freed, and so today we also should be liberated, and we have to have that one day of rest. He's saying, no, it's also for the sake of actually doing the work of Shabbat. You have to rise up from the place of degradation, whatever that is. It might be, again, a psychological or a sociological or an emotional place of degradation, and find yourself with ultimate freedom. And as our teacher taught, the essence of Shabbat is the memory of Yitziat Mitzrayim, because it is upon every Jew to remember that it is his life's work to leave Egypt. Mitzrayim, the term Mitzrayim, the source of the term is the word tsar, which is narrow. So sometimes, especially like Hasidic translations, sometimes translate Mitzrayim as narrow space, as that narrow space. So the essence of Shabbat is the memory of exculpating ourselves from those narrow places, because it's upon every Jew to remember that it is his life's work to leave Egypt, that narrow space, and with the strength of the holy Shabbat to bring redemption to the world. So according to the Slonim, when we observe Shabbat, this is, he's a mystic, he's a chassid, and so the observance of this mitzvah of removing those shackles of the six, that the whatever oppression the 6 days give us, pushing that off and focusing on the holiness of this day. And if there are limitations, rules, regulations, but they come from God. They're not coming from other human beings. In this understanding, this is what God wants us to do. It's not cultural limitations. So by observing this day, and of course all the positive, the singing, the food, the celebration, the festivity, all of this helps us to bring a greater redemption to the world. And I'll just say this, it's very interesting that I should have saved this article. I don't know where I saw it, or maybe it was in the newspaper, New York Times or something. But it's about the modern world we live in which we're we're so tethered to technology that Shabbat is a day to break away from that. And so there's this, there was this movement. I don't know if it's taken off, or maybe it was, but like one day a week, you just disconnect, and that's a way that we can raise ourselves up. So of course we Jews have already had it. We've had it for all these generations. We've had it with the Shabbat, and it is not easy. Especially, I have to admit, because of security, rabbis are now told you got to bring your phone with you on the Sabbath. You have to go to the synagogue. You have to have your phone with you because, God forbid, there's an attack. You need to have that access. So I carry it with me. And man, when it is in your hand, it is in your pocket, it is really, really hard to stay away from, let me just check. What did I see? Did anybody, an email? So it's hard. We're so tethered to all of these things that it is very, very valuable to have one day where we can break away from it. Okay, comments. I see there's a chat. Jim, you got a question?
Yeah, well, it's actually a comment and a question. So first of all, I don't remember which of the 10 commandments are not present in the Noahide laws. And so I don't know if I assume the one about observing the Sabbath is not a Noahide law.
Right.
Okay. So I guess that sort of leads me back to thinking, and especially from the earliest time, and given, all the importance that is ascribed I took many of these comments about, the rest. Some of it is physical rest, but it really is a metaphor for the spiritual, mental rest and restoration from, all the things that you've been encumbered by through the week, and sort of recharge your mental batteries.
Right.
Anyway, given the heavy emphasis on its value and its holiness, presumably because of its value, I guess what I don't understand is two things. One is, why did God wait until the Torah was given, as opposed to giving this to Adam or shortly thereafter when he was kicked out of Eden? Because it seems to be a universal necessity. The breed part is kind of a separate maybe connection, but as something so fundamental, the human structure, why this concept of Sabbath was, and especially since it goes back to the creation, why this didn't start right after the creation?
That's a really good question. I don't have a immediate answer for you, except to say that, again, you saw the passage about manna. So there was something pre-10 Commandments about the observance of the Sabbath. But that's a good question. Why not give it? Why not insist everybody observe the Sabbath?
And especially, I guess, since, excuse me, just for interjecting, because I guess, especially as, I don't know if it's part of the breed, or at least anyway from God, this was an opportunity to, restore and redeem a connection to God. So that shouldn't be restricted to Jews or whatever. So,
well, I guess now that I'm thinking some more about your question, I guess one answer would be is that, remember, the Jews are the first one who believe in this one God. Right. So if you
I have to interject, and I'm not sure where it was lost, but first you had Adam, so I assume
you're saying, right.
And then 10 generations you had Noah.
Right.
Okay. So he had a relationship, and some of the time frames in the Bible just drive me sort of nuts, because 10 generations, I don't know if that's enough to forget all this stuff, because it's been 3,000 years since we had the Torah, but be that as it may. We have this sort of reiteration of occasions between God, as we understand him, and some of these men. So,
right, but I'm just saying that, again, the Torah is our version of history. right? It's our story. So it is true, and it is a good question always, like, wait a minute, Adam and Eve, they believe in God, and Noah, what, all of a sudden they forgot about God? What happened? How did paganism come into the world? But remember, the Torah is our story. So we can't
I would
take it.
hope it would be consistent within itself and not always so self-referential.
Oh, all right, right. But my point is just that the Torah's understanding is that the other nations of the world, the other peoples in the world, they don't have this relationship with God. They have this relationship with paganism, idol worship. Um, um, uh, so therefore, they don't have this notion, this idea that one day a week everybody gets off, including your slaves, right? They're obviously in Egypt, the Jews didn't have Shabbat; they weren't allowed it. So I think that from the Jewish perspective, not taking this too literally, the whole the dynamic of the historical survey, I would say that it's probably the Torah's understanding is, yeah, I mean, if they accepted God like we did, they would have a Shabbat, but they didn't accept God. So therefore, that's the whole problem.
Well, I guess I want to say then sort of too, and I know the story and I don't know it very well, that God offered this special relationship to us after everybody turned it down.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's right. Yeah.
But be that as it may, so we expect God to sort of be better than that, bigger than that. So just because they turned it down, why didn't God,
Okay, but still,
for them?
all right, but still, Shabbat's not that easy, too, right? I mean, even Christians who they have the Sabbath, but they don't have the Sabbath like us, right? So their understanding of the Sabbath is different. So even if those other nations had taken it, maybe they wouldn't have understood it in the same way. But anyway,
No, that's possible. If it was so good for humanity, and God sits back on the seventh day and what He created is good and so forth, notwithstanding the fact that He wiped it out and all that kind of stuff, I guess I don't understand why, for the benefit of humanity.
Look, I'll tell you what. If I could get the Jews just in our congregation to observe Sabbath, I'd be happy. So you're talking about the whole world. So
well, if you were God, then
all right. Ginny, you have a question? Or Tony, I mean, you have a question?
Well, yes, and maybe most of you have that answer. I don't. What caused the day of the Sabbath for Jews to be Friday through Saturday, and Christians and the Catholics would be from Saturday through Sunday? What's the difference?
So I don't know the exact answer. Maybe somebody else has studied, or read about this. There's two answers that I've been given. One is that it was simply an attempt by Christians, and remember, Christianity is coming out of Judaism.
Right,
so
right.
The first Christians and followers of Jesus are Jews. I mean, they see themselves as Jews.
Right.
So as when Paul shows up and it becomes more of a separate, its own religion, there's this real need to separate. And so therefore, and there was still a lot of tension in between the two communities of, and one of the founding disputes between Judaism and Christianity is who's the new Israel, who's the real Israel. So as Christianity becomes more self-defined, they need to distinguish themselves, and so they move this Sabbath to Saturday or to Sunday, to make it on Sunday, because they're trying to distinguish and divide themselves or separate themselves from Jews who still have a hold on many of their followers. That's one thing I've heard. The other thing that I've heard is a Christian pastor explained to me that actually there isn't a difference. It's that I don't know if this is true for Catholics. He was a Protestant minister. That the Sabbath is still for Christians, just as is in the Bible, Saturday, seventh day of the week. Sunday, what they observe is the day of the Lord. So according to him, what he was telling me is that in a sense, there's 2 days. There's the Sabbath, which is the biblical day of rest, but then you have the day of the Lord, which is what Christians now observe. Now, I don't know enough about that, but I do think there probably is something to it. Calendars are really important in terms of distinguishing communities, and if your calendar is the same, then it's going to be very hard to create those boundaries.
Right.
So I think,
Rabbi, if I can interject,
Mhm.
I grew up Roman Catholic,
Uh-huh.
and in my understanding, the way I was taught was to quote my aunt, they stopped feeding us to the lions when we used the Romans' holy day, which was Sunday for the
Oh.
sun god.
Okay.
So they began to accept Catholics, but they really didn't accept us fully until the Sabbath day became their Sabbath day. When we shared the day with the sun god, I forget what his name is, but the Romans worshipped a deity, and Sunday was the day for that deity. And when Catholics used that day as well, then the violence against the Roman Catholics ended.
Well, yeah, and
That's a good one.
it's a good again, very good marketing if you're trying to convince people to the value of your faith to accommodate yourself to what they're used to. It's not so removed from a Jewish perspective. Most of Maimonides argues that the reason why he pulled back a little bit, there is a little this was very radical for the time, but that the reason why there was a developed sacrificial system in Judaism was not because animal sacrifice is the highest way to serve God, but rather because the Jews coming out of these pagan cultures, it's really hard to switch from from that perspective that worship is bringing offerings to purely liturgical, purely, worship of the lips. So there was this stage, and then of course then the temple's destroyed, and now what we have is this higher order of worship. Of course, I mean, traditional Judaism doesn't abide by that completely. It's looking forward to the day of the return of the temple and those sacrifices, that sacrificial service. But that's kind of that's the same idea. That what Ginny was suggesting is that if you're trying to make inroads with a wider community, you accommodate yourselves to their approach, and so they have an easier understanding of it. So that could be, I don't know. I don't know enough about the history.
Appreciate that.
All right. Well, anyway, next week, and I'll send this stuff out today, but next week, I think I did send it out last week, but I'll send it again, that we're going to talk about malacha, and we're going to talk about how detailed it is and all the areas of life that it impacts, or traditional observance impacts, and talk about, though, how do you live it today? We recognize that there are, it's the world that we live in makes it a little harder to follow some of these traditional practices, but nevertheless, it's good to strive for. So, all right, very good.
Question, Rabbi. Sorry, it's a little off the book, but your last comment really provoked something in me. So, are we to sort of take that, even though the Bible, the Torah, has animal sacrifices in it, correct? I mean, it's specified, demanded, all this kind of stuff. That if we go by this thing that it was so pervasive all around, that sort of the secular environment in which the early Israelites lived and so forth were incorporated into elements of the Torah.
Yeah, well, that's Maimonides' suggestion, is that's why we had originally a sacrificial system, because it was just what people were used to, and that's how they thought of worship. And so therefore they had to, again, you had to make some accommodation to what people are understand as worship. As when the temple's destroyed, though, we can survive without that sacred worship because it's not the only thing. It's not the only way to worship God. And in fact, it's
But as opposed to just saying, and if God had prohibited animal sacrifice, what this is sort of saying is, we got to do a little compromising here or mind melding
right.
by the authors of the Torah, the human contributors or whatever, as opposed to just coming straight from God himself.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, that's a good point, right? And that's why I think it's an argument. That's why many people weren't happy and pushed back against Maimonides, which he then kind of rescinded in a way. That's not what I meant, but of course that's what he was kind of leaning into. And I think that's yes, absolutely. We would. I mean, modern thinkers would absolutely agree with that. The Torah is at some level a cultural document. So
very good.
All right. Very good. We'll see everybody. Friday night. Don't forget about Friday night. Friday night live music, 5:00, and you can even bring your dinner. And Sarah Marcus is gonna, and Jeremy Brown are gonna lead us in a service with guitar music. So that's very exciting. 5:00 this Friday. All right. Okay.
Yes.
The performer herself.
Yeah. Thanks, Rabbi.
All right,
We'll see everyone Friday.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.